Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Harris Bard for Pond Life Aquatics and Tropical Fish London. And in today's video, we are going to be covering how you can help combat extreme heat in your ponds and aquariums, all the issues that can arise because of extreme heat, and all of the mitigating factors that you can take to prevent any dangers from occurring to your ponds, aquariums, or any critters that live inside of them. Let's get into it. So first things first, I think it's important for people to understand exactly why extreme heat can be dangerous for your aquatic friends. Increased temperature in your water depletes the amount of oxygen that can be stored. We call this dissolved oxygen content, and that is literally the amount of O2 that is dissolved within the water column, which allows your fish to breathe. The total amount of oxygen that can be dissolved in water decreases as temperature rises, which obviously is not a good thing, particularly for sensitive fish, which means they are having to literally work harder to live, which can obviously exacerbate any issues that the fish already has, and generally just increases the overall stress of your fish in your aquarium or ponds. Fish are cold-blooded creatures, which means they cannot regulate their own body temperatures. This means they are extraordinarily susceptible to heat, and it's important as a fish keeper for either aquariums or ponds to bear this in mind and come up with some solutions to help protect them in these situations. Heat is often called the silent killer in aquariums and ponds, and that is for all of the reasons I've highlighted previously. So it's important for you as an aquarist to be proactive instead of reactive to any hazards that may come about from an increased temperature spike in the atmosphere. This video is going to be split into two parts, where I first talk about aquariums and then talk about ponds. However, a lot of these principles apply to both, so excuse me if I do some repetition when it comes to ways to mitigate temperature in both ponds and aquariums. The first thing to consider when it comes to aquariums is always going to be location. If you have an aquarium in direct sunlight, it is going to be exposed to the sun's rays, which is obviously going to dramatically increase how quickly your aquarium heats up, particularly when it is sunny out. If you are first setting up an aquarium, then always make sure that you are trying to keep an aquarium out of direct sunlight. But if you've already set up your aquarium, think about closing your blinds and curtains during the day to stop sunlight from hitting your tank directly. This can hugely reduce the amount of a temperature spike that can occur in your aquarium, and can be the only thing that you need to consider when stopping your temperature from spiking. Something that's not discussed nearly as much, however, is the location of your aquarium to technology. Technology, particularly in the summer months, can get very, very warm, and you should bear this in mind, particularly when keeping things like temperate fish or goldfish. If you have your tank sat on top of something like a TV table, which we probably wouldn't recommend anyway, you may have some hi-fi systems or anything to do with technology sat relatively close to your aquarium, and this can cause a spike in temperature, particularly when they're running, and you do not want this, particularly on the hottest days of the year. Be aware where your tank is placed, and maybe consider not turning on these electrics to reduce the amount of heat that is hitting your aquarium. If blinds and changing location isn't a thing that you can do for your aquarium, maybe consider wrapping the aquarium itself in a reflective foil. This is a last case scenario, as it is somewhat unsightly and not the nicest thing to have to do to your aquarium in the first place, but as a last resort, I would definitely consider doing something like this to help reduce a temperature spike. The next thing to mention, and what probably should have been the first, is temperature monitoring is always going to be key. Make sure that you have a glass thermometer in your tank. I know a fair few people who don't use thermometers because they don't think they're very visually pleasing. However, I would always keep one to hand, and if you don't want to keep one in your aquarium itself, then do make sure that you're regularly checking the temperature of your tank at least just to make sure that you're not having any drastic spikes in temperature. Glass thermometers are relatively inexpensive and should be available at any retail shop worth their chops. So do just go to your local aquatic center and pick one up. They are usually cheap as chips. Now, let's say you've already thought about the location of your aquarium. It's not being hit by direct sunlight, but your house or flat is baking. We had a lot of customers call up this week concerned for their fish because their ambient temperature in their homes was already around 35 degrees. How can you actually cool down your aquarium once it's hit those high temperatures? Now, there are a number of ways you can do this, and one of the most inexpensive ways is to pick up a clip-on desk fan. Yes, those clip-on desk fans, the cheap ones that you see everyone walking around with from Amazon or Temu. You can literally clip these to the edge of your aquarium and they will push air across the surface of your tank and can draw away the hot air that is sat in your aquarium. This can help bring down your temperature by a fair few degrees and can reduce fatalities if you're in a tough spot. Now, for extreme cases and for particularly sensitive fish, there is always the option for chillers. Now, these are a relatively new thing, particularly in the UK, and we are looking to stock these at Pond Life Aquatics. So if you have any suggestions from manufacturers that do a good, reliable aquarium chiller, whether this is one with a heat sink or an actual liquid cooling system, please let us know in the comments below with any suggestions and we will definitely look into that. What these chillers or coolers do either have a metal heat sink which draws the heat away from the water itself and then pushes it away with a fan, or they actually have a dedicated cooling system. They are effectively a dry mount pump which pumps water from inside the aquarium out through a cooler and then back into the aquarium itself. Obviously, these systems are a lot more expensive than just your average clip-on fan, and something that I've seen people doing online instead of buying one of these expensive coolers is using actual PC cooling fans with a heat sink attached to them and kind of jerry-rigging them together to draw heat out of the aquarium itself, and apparently they work quite well. I've personally never tried it and may do so just because I'm interested in playing with gadgets. So if that's something that you would like to see me do and potentially do a tutorial on the channel, please just let me know in the comments below. Now, this next suggestion is something that I would say to use with extreme caution, and it's something that I've seen a fair few people doing in our aquariums, particularly in hotter climates like Indonesia, especially when they have very hot days and are keeping particularly sensitive fish. This is as a last resort to stop your entire tank from crashing if it's hitting things like 40 to 42 degrees. And that is using frozen bottles of water and actually placing them in the aquarium themselves. Obviously, this is going to drastically drop the temperature of the water, but it's not going to be flushing cold water directly into the tank itself. That is why people use the frozen bottles as opposed to just putting ice cubes directly into the tank itself. Now, this is something that should be used with extreme caution. It can upset your fish, it may cause them additional stress, but if you are in a situation where your temperature is spiking that drastically, it may be something that you should keep on hand, particularly if global warming ends up causing us all to have 40-degree-centigrade days where we are just going to have to do these things to keep our fish alive. And obviously, this is a much cheaper alternative than investing in a dedicated fish system cooler. Now, this next option is something that I actually suggest to a fair few of our customers, and it's something that I do myself at this time of year. Try to do small partial water changes regularly, particularly on hotter days. Do this with slightly cooler water than your tank. Don't use really cold water to try and drastically drag down the temperature, as you will cause even more stress to your fish. But just doing very small partial water changes with slightly cooled water. Obviously use a good chlorinator, like NT Labs Optimus, which we recommend here at Aquatics, is not only going to increase your water quality, but will bring down the temperature of your tank ever so slightly. We've been doing that regularly today, particularly after the hot weather yesterday, where we've gone round to some of our regular customers and done partial water changes just to bring the temperature down to a little bit more of normality. This can be a huge benefit, particularly for fish that are more sensitive to heat, like hill stream loach, or more diminutive species that are obviously going to be more stressed at higher heats. And it should be something that everyone does relatively often anyway, so definitely one to consider, particularly on hotter days. Now, finally, to one of the most important crossover points between ponds and aquariums, boosting the amount of oxygen or dissolved oxygen in your water column. As I said, the amount of DO or dissolved oxygen drastically lowers when temperatures are higher, which can cause a huge amount of metabolic stress for your fish. An air pump and air stone are an excellent way of causing a greater amount of surface disturbance, which allows for a greater dilution of oxygen into the tank itself as it increases the amount of gas exchange that occurs. Now, for those of you who just want it in simple English, putting a bubbler on your tank stops your fish from dying. Obviously, this isn't always going to work, particularly if you have a huge temperature spike and it just ends up messing your fish up because of the temperature itself. But in situations where your fish are suffocating, so when they are gasping at the surface in particular, or looking extraordinarily lethargic and laying on the base of the aquarium itself, a bubbler can really save the day. You don't have to go crazy with buying the most expensive one on the market. We recommend the APS series by Tetra here at Aquatics. They are relatively inexpensive. They don't cause a huge amount of noise. And if you don't want a bubbler in your aquarium all the time, which I completely understand as someone who also does aquascapes, just having one to hand that on hotter days you can plug in, put an air stone inside of your aquarium and not have to worry about your fish suffering nearly as much. It will just put your mind at ease as a fish keeper. Thankfully, yesterday we had very, very minimal issues, even in this extreme heat, because we have so much dissolved oxygen going into every single one of our aquariums here at Aquatics and Tropical Fish London. And I'll be honest, I think it is down to the maturity of our filters and the fact that every single one of them is pretty much an air filter that is hugely increasing the amount of dissolved oxygen that is readily available in the tank themselves. Now, if you're really against having a bubbler to hand, then making sure that your aquarium filter's outlet is pointed towards the surface, particularly on hotter days, can again help mitigate risk. Having that surface disturbance, as I said, allows for a greater oxygen exchange and will increase the amount of dissolved oxygen in the tank itself. On taller tanks in particular, you can also drop the level of the tank itself, which allows for water to splash down from your filter's outlet. This works particularly well for hang-on back filters or some internal power heads, and genuinely does help your fish breathe better. Obviously, you don't want to be jacking up your circulation too much, particularly fish that are sensitive to high circulation. And personally, I would always recommend just having a spare air pump at home that you can just whack onto your aquarium and not have to worry about it. Now, in terms of preparing your aquarium for hotter weather, there are some maintenance and general care things that you can go over in the build up to a heat wave if you are one that follows the weather. Reducing the amount of feeding on the days that there is hot weather and possibly on the days leading up to it can hugely help reduce the stress of your fish. We've actually stopped feeding our fish on really hot days here at Aquatics and Tropical Fish London because heat means that your fish is going to have an increased metabolism, which means they're going to be creating more waste, which waste is going to be using up even more oxygen than it usually would in the tank. Also, food goes off much quicker, particularly in hotter climates, and you do not want this degrading your tank's water quality, as this will also use up dissolved oxygen. So fasting your fish for a couple of days is not going to kill them and could potentially save their lives. Something else in particular to think about in the build up to hot weather is to think about reducing the amount of fish you're keeping in a single aquarium. Obviously, you should never think about overcrowding your tanks, but this is particularly important in hot weather when there is going to be a temperature spike. Obviously, every single fish is a living thing. They all metabolize, and that is just going to speed up in hot weather, which is also going to reduce the amount of oxygen in tanks. We've had a lot of people who keep more fish than they probably should be, in smaller aquariums in particular, having issues with losing fish in the hot weather because they haven't taken advice by buying things like bubbler and haven't taken advice in understocking their aquariums in the first place. And unfortunately, it can lead to fatalities. If you have the space and know there is going to be a prolonged season of hot weather, potentially think about setting up a separate tank for your fish, separating them out, and even having just a larger aquarium. A larger aquarium is always going to have more oxygen in it than a smaller aquarium. So if you've been thinking about upgrading your aquarium to house more fish, why not just upgrade anyway to give your fish a better life and prevent them from dying in the heat? Now is a really good time to be thinking about having increased space, more tanks, and making sure that the fish that you already have are kept in the best way possible. Speaking of keeping fish in the best way possible, it's really important at this time of year to make sure that your tanks are well filtrated and that you are keeping on top of your maintenance. Fish aren't the only things that metabolize in your tanks. Any waste material is going to be packed full of bacteria. Now, sometimes that bacteria isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially the bacteria that we have in filter media, for example. But if you haven't cleaned your filter in a long time and you've got a huge amount of waste build up in there, there is going to be bacteriums that are obviously going to be metabolizing. The increased temperature means that they metabolize faster and can use up the dissolved oxygen that is in the tank itself. Think about keeping your filters well maintained at this time of year. And if you are really concerned about having an overstocked tank, even consider getting a bigger filtration system. It can't hurt, and it's only going to improve your overall fish's life quality. Even better, get a bubble filter so that you have the dual whammy combo of having aeration and increased biological filtration inside of your aquarium, which is just going to make everything at this time of year much, much easier. And finally, I'm going to talk about live plants. Having live plants in your aquarium is going to increase the amount of dissolved oxygen during the day. Particularly fast-growing stem planting, things like hornwort, things like polysperma, and any number of fast-growing, easy-to-grow stem plants are going to produce lots and lots of oxygen for your fish to use during the day. Now, this can be somewhat of a double-edged sword. You don't want to overcram your aquarium with planting, and by overcram, I mean literally overgrown with planting, as plants do respire, they do metabolize. So at night, when they are not photosynthesizing and putting oxygen into the water, they are going to be dumping a certain amount of CO2 into the tank itself. And you don't want to cause asphyxiation, particularly during the nighttime when you can't then react to anything that's going on in the tank itself. So I would recommend increasing the amount of oxygenating plants in the tank itself, but not to a point when you're inadvertently going to cause a greater issue in general. And finally, while talking about plants, you should think about reducing your photo period. I of course mean your lighting hours. If you are having issues with temperature, particularly in your aquariums, lights are one of the most heat-producing elements of the aquarium itself. Reducing the amount of light, obviously not to the detriment of your live planting, as this will obviously, again, increase the amount of waste in the tank itself when your plants inevitably die if you completely turn off your lighting. Reducing the amount of hours that your light is on is going to reduce the amount of heat that is put into the water. So for me, I have taken to turning off my lights in the middle of the day. I do this either using the Fluval app for my Fluval lighting or a very simple timer where I will just have a non-photo period in the middle of the day, or even better, I've just been pushing my photo period back to the cooler hours of the day itself. When my flat is going to be hottest, the lights are not on. This again is just going to reduce the amount of stress that's occurring for your fish, and overall may reduce your tank by a fair few degrees, particularly in the hottest moments of the hottest days. So that is definitely something to consider. Now, moving on to ponds. Now, when it comes to ponds, you've obviously got less options when it comes to giving them shade. But something that you can consider, particularly on the hottest days of the year, is by putting garden planting around the outside of your pond. Even trees that you can plant in pots, although you should be aware of leaf fall falling into your ponds, can create a decent amount of shade, which can obviously decrease the amount your pond is going to spike in temperature on the hottest days of the year. A much more easy to do solution for most people is adding floating plant to your pond. If you've got carp species, then this may just end up being an expensive meal for them. But adding things like water lilies can hugely improve the amount of shade there is in the pond itself. The water lilies will enjoy being in full sunlight, while their lily pads will obviously reduce the amount of light directly hitting the surface of the water. Now, if you don't want to be feeding your koi expensive lilies in any capacity, then you can use things like floating baskets, which again will just reduce the amount of sunlight directly hitting the surface of the pond itself. One thing to consider about using floating plants, you shouldn't let them cover more than 50% of the total of the pond itself. Now, this is just a number that I have plucked out of the ether, but there is a general consensus that too much plant cover on the surface of a pond itself does not allow for a good enough oxygen exchange, which is obviously the thing we want to encourage, particularly in hotter weathers. So floating plants are an excellent addition to help reduce the amount of direct sunlight hitting a pond itself, but you don't want to have so much coverage that you are completely restricting the amount of oxygen that can dissolve into a pond in general. Now, for ponds, aeration and circulation is as much, if not more important than in aquariums. You want to have as much circulation and as much aeration in a pond at this time of year as possible. That means having pumps that are going to be pumping the water, particularly causing surface agitation, which is going to allow for a greater oxygen exchange and obviously increase the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water itself. There's lots of filters that sit on the outside of ponds, which allow for a cascade into the pond itself, which is obviously going to help aerate. Waterfalls are a great addition to ponds at this time of year, and anything that is going to allow for splashing of water onto the surface of the pond is just going to hugely increase the amount of dissolved oxygen inside of the pond, which is obviously going to help your fish in hotter temperatures. And finally, and my biggest recommendation for any pond at this time of year, is to get a dedicated pond aerator onto your pond. For me, particularly when you are keeping larger species like koi or sensitive species like orf, is a must. Having an air pump on a pond or a lake or any body of water is only going to be a good thing at this time of year. It's not the bubbles themselves that push oxygen into the water, it is the surface disturbance. So if you can get an air pump with a larger amount of gangs on it and then have more air stones, it's just going to be better for your fish, even if it's just on the hottest days. Obviously, for things like koi, we always recommend having an air pump on the pond anyway, but for people who are keeping things like infinity pools and don't want to have unsightly air lines or this bubbling at all times of year, just have an air pump to hand. It will save your koi on the hottest days of the year. It will save all of your fish on the hottest days of the year, and it's one of the best things you can do for the health of your aquatic friends in the hottest temperatures. It is genuinely a non-negotiable for anyone keeping fish in ponds, period. Now, if you for some reason are thinking about building a pond after that rant, think about building a pond that is deeper than shallower. Obviously, shallower ponds are much more susceptible to temperature swings. There is less water and much more of it is exposed to the heat and direct sunlight. And obviously this is going to heat up quicker than ponds that are particularly deep. The coolest part of a pond is always going to be at the bottom. So if you are building koi ponds or even just a goldfish pond, think about going deeper rather than wider. This is going to help reduce metabolic stress to your fish and will, in general, be better at keeping dissolved oxygen inside of your pond than shallower ponds. The cooler the temperature, the more oxygen. That is something that everyone should just understand the principle of, and having a deeper pond is obviously going to be cooler and therefore have more oxygen in it. If you do have a shallow pond, then just make sure that you're taking the rest of the advice that is given. Make sure that there's plenty of shade in the form of floating plants, lilies, and make sure that you have good circulation, good filtration, and get an air pump for your pond at this time of year. If you are worried or you don't have access to electrics, there's plenty of very, very good solar pumps and materials that you can use at this time of year. In terms of maintenance, it's very similar to what you should be doing in your aquarium. You want to reduce the amount of feeding for all the same reasons that I covered inside. The fish's metabolism is higher because of the heat. They're going to produce more waste, and more waste means less oxygen. So reduce the amount of feeding, even for your prize koi. They will not die over the course of a few days of fasting or just reducing the feeding overall. Again, the same as your aquariums, making sure that your filters are well maintained at this time of year is crucial. Reducing the amount of biological waste inside of a pond is always going to be a good thing. Desludging the base of your pond at this time of year is also a great thing to be doing. This sludge is full of bacteria that's going to be metabolizing, and as soon as you get a heat spike, this metabolic process is just going to speed up, reduce the amount of oxygen that is inside of your ponds, and will cause your fish and any other creatures living in your pond stress. Desludging is always going to be good. Using a sludge preventing product like sludge bombs is always going to be a good thing. If you're concerned that you don't have good enough filtration, then think about investing in a new filter. We personally always recommend people to get things like Filtrals by Waza here at Aquatics for a all-in-one internal pond. These have a spout that shoots towards the surface, which is also going to cause a good amount of agitation. Or if you have the budget, get a good external filtration system that is going to cause even more surface agitation, have a bigger biological capacity that is going to reduce the amount of sludge and debris inside your pond, and make sure that you are keeping on top of maintaining these products. Next up is something that I shouldn't get as wound up about as I am. The amount of people who have called up in the past few days saying their fish are suffering because of the heat, but they have not topped up their ponds. Make sure your ponds are topped up at this time of year. I completely understand about wanting to allow natural ponds or any pond to have natural rainwater fall into it and fill. However, we have had a very small amount of water here in the UK in the past few months, and you should be topping up your pond. It is an artificial body of water, and if you do not keep it topped up, it will just return to land. Make sure you're using a good dechlorinator like NT Labs Optimus and a biological booster like NT Labs Optimus in your ponds. We also recommend for ponds things like Kusuri, Chlorgo. There's any number of products that are good dechlorinators that are just going to make topping up your ponds completely and utterly safe for wildlife. Keep your ponds topped up. Not only will it increase the depth, which will stop huge drastic temperature swings, but that water hitting the surface is going to increase the amount of disturbance, it's going to increase the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water itself, and taps tend to be a little bit cooler. So they are obviously going to bring down the temperature of your pond. On the hottest day of the year, it even might be a good idea to try and perform partial water changes, or just keep the hose on your pond on a really slow top up to keep the temperature down. Sorry for getting on my soapbox about that. So many people have called in the past few days asking if it's safe to top up your ponds. Yes, we have so many good chlorinators that work. They are not snake oils. They work for a reason that all fish keepers should be using in their ponds and even in their aquariums. Keep your ponds and aquariums topped up at this time of year. And finally, for ponds in particular, keep an eye on algae blooms. Obviously, you're always going to have some degree of algae growing in your pond. It is an outdoor aquatic space. You're going to have algae growing. There's not a huge amount you can do. But if you are having a huge amount of blanket weed growing or algae growing on the surface, it may be a sign that you have an imbalance in the pond itself. Whether that just be the amount of waste in the pond feeding algae or for any other reason. But when you see an algal bloom at this time of year, try and remove as much of the algae as possible. A small amount of algae isn't an issue, but if you are getting mats and mats of blanket weed, physically pull the blanket weed out. Yes, algae does produce oxygen. It produces 50% of all the oxygen in the world, in fact. But at night, particularly when a pond is being choked with blanket weed, algae keep metabolizing and can cause an oxygen crash at night. Oftentimes, people's fish will be completely fine during the day, and then the next morning they'll go outside and their fish will unfortunately have died. Mitigating the amount of algae that's growing on the surface of your pond or in your pond itself can help stop this from happening. And if you are getting huge algal blooms, particularly blanket weed, consider why that is. Do you have a buildup of sludge in the base of the pond? Consider removing it. Have you not been cleaning your filtration? Consider cleaning your filtration. Have you not got sufficient filtration? Then consider getting better filtration in your pond. A lot of what can help mitigate the risk to your fish in your ponds and even in your aquariums at this time of year is just good, regular maintenance. That is always going to be a good idea for any aquarist or hobbyist fish keeper. Now, as I wrap up this video, I just want to make it clear for the visual things that you should look out for both aquarium and pond fish when it comes to oxygen depletion, particularly in hotter weathers. As I said earlier, a lot of fish, when they are oxygen depleted, will come to the surface of the pond and actually put their mouths to the surface of the water. We call this gasping, where they are literally gasping for air on the surface of the ponds, and you should be very acutely aware of when this is going on. There's plenty of videos online which will show you this. I will just say it can be quite distressing to look at, but if you're concerned that your fish are gasping and need a visual representation, then just Google what it looks like. There is plenty of evidence online that will show you what this looks like. It is not them looking for food, it is a very different visual cue. Additionally, you should look for increased gill movement of your fish. Obviously, you should be looking at your fish regularly anyway, so you should have some idea of how they usually behave. If their gills are moving much more rapidly than usual, this can be a sign of overexposure to heat and oxygen deprivation, and should be something that you're acutely aware of. Now, in terms of more early signs, lethargy and loss of appetite is one of the key visuals for a lot of fish when it comes to overexposure to heat, because it is just an increase in stress. If your fish become extraordinarily lethargic and they are just lying on the base of your pond or on the base of your aquarium and not behaving how they usually are, it is sometimes, not always, a sign of visual stress and should be something that everyone is acutely aware of. Luckily, I haven't got a lot of video of this, so sorry if there isn't any B-roll and this is just me spieling, but these are the visual cues that you should be aware of if you are worried about your fish. However, if you have taken the advice I have given earlier in this video, whether it's for ponds or aquariums, hopefully you should never have to experience this. So, final checklist. What should you do if you've got a huge temperature spike in your pond or aquarium? Aeration. Make sure that your aquarium air pump is now turned on with a good air stone and good surface disturbition. If you haven't got one to hand, make sure your filter is running correctly with good amount of surface disturbition on the top of the aquarium itself. The idea is just make sure there is more agitation on the surface of the water to increase the amount of oxygen that is able to go into the water itself. Next up, perform small and cooler water changes to your pond or aquarium. This can be an absolute lifesaver for a lot of fish, particularly in the hottest parts of the day. And finally, reducing the amount of lighting in your aquarium, reducing the amount of light hitting your aquarium, reducing the amount of light hitting your pond, whether that be through closing your curtains, adding lilies, turning your lights off in your aquarium itself, reducing anything that is going to increase the temperature of your tank or pond is crucial in the hottest moments of the day if your fish are suffering. So on that lovely note, as we have been talking about a very stressful situation, if you have any questions whatsoever or want any recommendations for different products, then feel free to drop a comment below. If you found this video helpful, then please let me know in the comments below as well, and share it to anyone you know who has an aquarium or a pond. It's come to my attention that about 90% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so if you would like to subscribe, it does really help the channel out. And obviously commenting, liking and sharing is going to help the channel grow, which is obviously going to help the store, and it's going to help us produce more videos and more content for you guys that's more educational, and also it helps my ego. So for now, that is all from me here at Aquatics, and I hope you'll join me again next time for this pond life.